The opening of the 20th century was a period of mourning in Great Britain, following the death of Queen Victoria. Her reign coincided with a period of great industrial and scientific progress that propelled Britain to become the world's first truly global superpower. Her death marks a symbolic turning point in the history of Western civilization, as the next 100 years would see more social and political upheaval, conflict and revolution than perhaps any other century in human history. It was a world in which Britannia ruled the waves. On the 9th of October 1906, HMS Dreadnought set sail for her first sea trial from Devonport Dockyard. Her revolutionary design of a uniform main gun battery and steam propulsion obsoleted all current active warships, and her name became synonymous with an entire generation of battleships. Her launch appeared to cement the unassailable might of the Royal Navy, the cornerstone of British imperial power, playing a vital role in defending the empire on which the sun never set. The tumultuous changes of the 20th century began, as political and social revolutions generally do, with a revolution in the field of abstract ideas. The post-Victorian world was about to have its fundamental conceptions of human nature and mankind's place in the universe challenged by two groundbreaking theories. Sigmund Freud published his book, The Interpretation of Dreams, in 1899, introducing his theory of the unconscious mind. This concept of humanity as filled with subconscious destructive desires played into pre-existing fears that many elites at the time held about the unwashed masses. The notion that society was a powder keg waiting to explode began to gain traction. In 1905, Albert Einstein published 4 groundbreaking papers introducing his special theory of relativity and laying the groundwork for modern quantum theory. This revolution in physics further challenged Western man's understanding of his place in the universe. In the heart of London, others were beginning to challenge the strict social morality that had characterised Victorian England. The Bloomsbury set, a small clique of artists and writers, built upon the shared social life and intellectual leanings of the group's core members. They placed the highest importance on interpersonal relationships, as well as art for art's sake, a firm rejection of the values of the Victorian bourgeois, who they held in disdain as camera-totting fact addicts. On the 28th of June 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated by Yugoslav nationalist Gavrilo Princip, shooting the Archduke and his wife with a pistol when their car had stopped near the Latin Bridge in Sarajevo. This event led to the Austro-Hungarian Empire declaring war on Serbia, in turn causing a chain reaction of Austro-Hungary and Serbia's allies declaring war on each other. It was the spark that ignited a network of secret alliances, leading to the outbreak of the First World War. The carnage of World War I convinced many that Freud's vision of a fragile facade of civilization struggling to hold back the destructive subconscious desires of the masses contained an element of truth. It was in the aftermath of World War I that Oswald Spengler published the first volume of Decline of the West, which was a commercial success, particularly in his homeland of Germany. Spengler drew an analogy between civilizations and living organisms. They had a vitality in their youth, but as they age, they become decrepit and die, as the focus of life moves from the countryside to the large urban centres of later civilization. Spengler painted a picture of civilizations going through seasonal changes, as the forces of rationalism and materialism slowly suffocate the early spirit of idealism, ultimately causing the civilization to perish. When the Bolsheviks seized power in the 1917 October Revolution, they immediately sought peace with the Central Powers by signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, under the terms of which Russia lost huge amounts of territory, including Finland, the Baltics, and the Ukraine. Opposition to the treaty was a rallying call for the White Armies as Russia descended into post-revolution civil war. This conflict dragged on for over 5 years, resulting in a resounding victory for the Bolsheviks, who used their expertise in propaganda to decisive effect. Bertrand Russell recalls a meeting with Lenin in 1920.
I met Lenin in 1920 when I was in Russia. I had an hour's talk tete-a-tete with him, and he spoke English much better than you would have expected. The whole conversation was in English. I expected it to have been in German, but I found that his English was quite good. I was less impressed by Lenin than I expected to be. He was, of course, a great man. He seemed to me a reincarnation of Cromwell, with exactly the same limitations that Cromwell had. Absolute orthodoxy. He thought a proposition could be proved by quoting a text in Marx. And he was quite incapable of supposing that there could be anything in Marx that wasn't right. And that struck me as rather limited. I disliked one other thing about him, which was his great readiness to stir up hatred. I put certain questions to him to see what his answer would be, and one of them was, you profess to be establishing socialism, but as far as the countryside is concerned, you seem to me to be establishing peasant proprietorship, which is a very different thing from agricultural socialism. And he said, oh, dear me, no, we're not establishing peasant proprietorship. He said, you see, there are poor peasants and rich peasants, and we stirred up the poor peasants against the rich peasants, and they soon hanged them to the nearest tree. Ha, 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 ha. I didn't much like that.
The Ottoman Empire, that at its height in 1683 had stretched from Mecca to Belgrade, had joined the First World War on the side of the Central Powers and collapsed with their defeat. The internal convulsions of the Arab Revolt led to many subjugated Arab provinces to seek independence. It ended with the occupation of Istanbul by the Allies and the Young Turk Revolution that created the modern Republic of Turkey. The devastation of the First World War had impacted Europe and the world in many ways. In the aftermath, the rise of the art of propaganda became one of the defining political developments of the early 20th century. In 1923, Sigmund Freud's nephew Edward Bernays published Crystallizing Public Opinion, one of the earliest works defining the field we now refer to as public relations. Bernays argued that although the average citizen may have strong convictions, they are unable to articulate why they hold them. People have logic-proof compartments in their minds that can only be influenced by methods beyond the rational.
When I got back from the war, I recognized that ideas could be as important weapons as anything. And first, I called what we did publicity direction. I would direct the conduct of people so that they could win through ideas their public goals. And soon I found out that I could give advice and a person could win his or her goals, whether it was to become an elected official or whether to become the head of a corporation or whether to sell ideas or a product.
Bernays' techniques were even sought after by the League of Nations, the organisation that had attempted to maintain the global balance of power since its inception at the Treaty of Versailles. The League of Nations was the prototype United Nations, but was always hampered by its failure to secure the membership of the isolationist USA. Any hopes the League may have had for maintaining global peace vanished when Germany, Italy and Japan all left in the years 1933 to 34. While the rest of the West had been enjoying the Roaring Twenties, Weimar Germany was suffering the misery of hyperinflation, having fought World War I on heavy borrowing, hoping the debt would be repaid by forcing reparations on the defeated Allies. When the exact opposite happened, Germany was forced to print even more money to pay Allied reparations. By the end of 1922, the exchange rate was 7,400 marks to $1. By the end of 1923, a loaf of bread cost over 200 billion marks. The extravagance of the 1920s ended with the Wall Street crash of 1929. The Dow Jones lost over 20% of its value over 2 days in October 1929 and would continue falling until mid-November, the beginning of the slide into the Great Depression, when global GDP fell by an estimated 15% over the 3 years from 1929 to 1932. Some countries would still be suffering from the negative economic fallout until the outbreak of World War II. It was during the Great Depression that Aldous Huxley published Brave New World, a dystopian vision of the future where humanity is seduced into compliance with a totalitarian society via a process of psychological conditioning and drug-induced euphoria. It was part of a growing trend of dystopian literature where technological advancement made possible previously unthinkable levels of political control.
In your writing, particularly in Enemies of Freedom, you attack Madison Avenue, which controls most of our television and radio, advertising, newspaper advertising, and so forth. Why do you consistently attack the advertising agency?
Well, no, I think that advertisement plays a very necessary role, but the danger, it seems to me, in a democracy is this. I mean, what does a democracy depend on? A democracy depends on the individual voter making an intelligent and rational choice for what he regards as his enlightened self-interest in any given circumstance. But what these people are doing, I mean, what both for their particular purposes for selling goods and the dictatorial propagandists are doing, is to try to bypass the rational side of man and to appeal directly to these unconscious forces below the surface, so that you are, in a way, making nonsense of the whole democratic procedure, which is based on conscious choice on rational grounds.
Examples of the media misinforming the public about important global events were evident even back in 1932. Walter Duranty was awarded a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on the conditions of life in the Soviet Union for the New York Times, but he has since been heavily criticized for his role in downplaying the severity of the Holodomor, when millions died of starvation in the fallout from Stalin's collectivization of agriculture. Once the Soviets had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939, often referred to as the Non-Aggression Pact, Europe was once again destined for a destructive war that would engulf the entire world and drastically alter the global power structure. The Second World War was the most destructive war in all human history, and its final decisive acts, the use of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, fundamentally changed the nature of war altogether. Lasting for 6 years and 1 day, and resulting in the deaths of possibly as many as 70 million civilians and combatants, it was the defining event of the 20th century. So much so that all other 20th century events are considered pre- or post-war. It was during World War II that James Burnham published The Managerial Revolution. Burnham had studied at Princeton before spending a year at Oxford, where he was tutored by J.R.R. Tolkien. He was heavily involved in the American Communist movement until he became disillusioned with the direction taken by the revolution in Russia. Burnham saw the West and Russia as undergoing what he called the managerial revolution. Power was shifting from individual capitalists and industrialists to a new class of managers who had specific technical expertise. Burnham had witnessed this unfold in the development of the USSR. Realizing that an increase in state ownership had merely led to an increase in the power of the managers, rather than the promise of empowering the masses. The same process that was nearly complete in Russia and Germany was underway in the United States in the form of the New Deal. Burnham was aware that any managerial elite would need to wrap itself in an ideology to keep the masses on side by ostensibly appearing to appeal to their interests. Managerial ideologies can take many shapes and forms. It was Burnham's vision of a world divided into three competing superpowers, all centered around the major industrial areas of the United States, Europe, and Japan, that provided the framework for the fictional powers of Eurasia, East Asia, and Oceania in George Orwell's 1984. Orwell's dystopian novel would become one of the most famous books of the 20th century. Perhaps less well known is the list of potential communist sympathizers he prepared for the Information Research Department in 1949. It included such luminaries as actors Charlie Chaplin and Katharine Hepburn, historians J.P. Taylor and E.H. Carr, and the future Labour leader Michael Foot. Suspicions of communist subversion were at an all-time high in the early post-war era.
In recognizing a communist, physical appearance counts for nothing. If he openly declares himself to be a communist, we take his word for it. If a person consistently reads and advocates the views expressed in a communist publication, he may be a communist. If a person supports organizations which reflect communist teachings, or organizations labeled communist by the Department of Justice, she may be a communist. If a person defends the activities of communist nations while consistently attacking the domestic and foreign policy of the United States, she may be a communist. If a person does all these things over a period of time, he must be a communist. But there are other communists who don't show their real faces, who work more silently.
As the celebrations of victory in World War II were confronted by the harsh realities of potential future conflict between the remaining superpowers. The Second World War had decisively ended European global dominance, leaving only the United States and the USSR as genuinely sovereign political entities. While Britain had prevented her mainland from being occupied during the war, she could do little to prevent the dissolution of her global empire in its aftermath. India had always been the jewel in the crown of Britain's imperial domain, ever since it had been subjugated by the British East India Company in the 18th century. Northern India had previously been ruled by the Mughal Empire, established by a descendant of Genghis Khan after the Battle of Panipat, and controlled the area that is modern Pakistan. The Indian subcontinent was ruled by the Maharatha Confederacy, a group of Hindu aristocrats who held power from 1674 until the Third Anglo-Maratha War that lasted from 1817 to 1819. The early 20th century saw the beginnings of the Pakistan movement, whose aim was the establishment of an Islamic state separate from any future independent India. Their demands were formalised in the 1940 Lahore Declaration, and as independence became a fait accompli after the fallout of the Bengal famine and World War II, tensions between the Muslim and Hindu communities began to rise. On the 16th of August 1946, Muslims and Hindus clashed in Calcutta, resulting in hundreds of deaths. Fearing a potential civil war, the British agreed to the demands of the All Indian Muslim League and partitioned India into 3 separate sovereign states: India, Pakistan, and East Pakistan, which would become modern-day Bangladesh. When independence was declared in August 1947, enormous population movements occurred as Muslims in India and Hindus and Sikhs in Pakistan, caught on the wrong side of the religious divide, were attacked by mobs in violence that led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. Just to bring you up to speed, Sadiq.
Grandparents were refugees. They left India to go to Pakistan when the British Empire decided to carve up India.
The immediate post-war period was where much of the legislative infrastructure that governs the modern world was created. The Bretton Woods system tied global currencies to the gold standard via the US dollar, and also saw the creation of the International Monetary Fund. The United Nations was formed as a replacement for the defunct League of Nations, but with the same mandate of securing a lasting world peace. This formidable task was not made any easier when Alger Hiss, who had been involved in the establishment of the organisation as a State Department official, was accused of being a Soviet spy in 1948, tarnishing the legitimacy of the United Nations in the eyes of much of the American public. The UN was powerless to prevent the nuclear arms race, and suspicions of widespread Soviet infiltration within the United States reached new heights when several high-level scientists, including Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, Morton Sobel, and Carl Fuchs, were all convicted of passing nuclear secrets to the Soviets, saving them years of research in the development of atomic weapons. The United Nations continued its faltering start when the adoption of Resolution 181 by the General Assembly, which recommended the creation of an independent Jewish homeland after the British mandate for Palestine officially ended on the 14th of May 1948, plunged the region into a cycle of violence that continues to this day. Almost immediately after the petition plan was adopted, violent clashes occurred between Zionist nationalists and the Arab community in Palestine, with the British government trying to maintain control. Tensions remained high and war broke out between the newly formed country of Israel and its surrounding Arab neighbours the moment the British departed. Israel won a surprise victory in a war that lasted for just over 9 months, and resulted in the Israelis controlling considerably more territory than they had been allotted in the partition plan. The mutual distrust triggered by the events of this war lingers to this day. A massacre committed by Zionist paramilitaries in the village of Deir Yassin sparked a widespread exodus of Arab refugees, and the Middle East would become a focal point of conflict for the rest of the 20th century. In 1931, Imperial Japan had invaded the province of Manchuria. After the Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937, a full-scale war broke out between China and Japan. China had been in a state of civil war at the time of the invasion, but the communists led by Mao and the nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek formed a united front against the common enemy. It was not enough to prevent the Japanese from capturing the capital Nanking, which became the scene of an infamous massacre. The war dragged on for 8 years, entering a stalemate as the Japanese did not have the manpower to control the countryside. When the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, combined with the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, the Japanese were forced to surrender. The invasion had a devastating impact on China's population and economy. Millions of Chinese had been killed, and the Chinese currency was undergoing hyperinflation. This was bad news for nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek, as it destroyed the savings of the middle class, from whom he drew most of his support. At a vital moment, Chiang Kai-shek sought a loan of $200 million from the Americans to help negate the effects of inflation, but was denied, partly thanks to the opposition of US Treasury Representative to China, Solomon Adler, later revealed to be a Soviet spy in the Verona Papers. Mao's Communist Army had emerged from the Second Sino-Japanese War better organized and equipped. Fighting between the nationalists and communists resumed in 1948, and the newly formed PLA launched a decisive campaign against the nationalist armies. The People's Republic of China was founded on the 1st of October 1949, with what remained of the nationalist government fleeing to Taiwan. The loss of the world's most populous state to communism was a severe blow to the foreign policy ambitions of the new leader of the Western world, the United States, who had inherited the mantle from a militarily and financially exhausted Great Britain. Korea, which had been ruled by Japan before the war, was now separated into US and Soviet zones of influence. Galvanized by their victory in China, the communists had the wind in their sails, and Stalin greenlit an invasion of South Korea by the north. On the 25th of June 1950, North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel. The rapid communist advance alarmed Washington, who feared all Southeast Asia would soon fall to communism, and decided to intervene under the auspices of a United Nations Security Council resolution. The initial stages of the war were highly fluid, but became bogged down in a stalemate along the 38th parallel after the Chinese intervention in late 1950. The conflict ended in a ceasefire in 1953, and the uneasy peace has just about held since.
It's a curious thing, you know, about where one's roots are. I know very well that my own roots are here in London. And I suppose that's because, as a child, I grew up here when I was very small.
Back in England, historian Arnold Toynbee was completing his magnus opus, The Study of History. Volumes 7 to 10 being published in 1954. Despite its initial popularity, Toynbee has been virtually ignored by modern historians, and much of his work has been left to gather dust. Toynbee concluded that the civilization was the correct unit for the interpretation of history, and that civilizations were born from a process of challenge and response. When the forces of a society shifted from ancestor worship to those who develop new techniques and ideas. The breakdown of a civilization occurs when this creative minority devolves into a dominant minority, concerned only with maintaining its grip on power. This process ends with the establishment of a universal state. For example, the Roman Empire provided the universal state of Hellenic civilization. Once a civilization has stopped growing, its culture will become vulgar and stagnant, with social disintegration the inevitable result. Although civilizations can continue to expand economically and militarily for some time, after losing their cultural allure. Another prominent figure of 20th century intellectual life, Bertrand Russell, published The Impact of Science on Society in 1952. An examination of how the scientific technique could potentially influence politics for both good and ill, Russell posits two ideas: world government by a single sovereign entity and the necessity of controlling the world's population. Ideas that would gain increasing favour with Western elites as the 20th century progressed. Russell, the great rationalist, is forced to concede the effectiveness of Bernays-style propaganda, that limelight and a brass band are more persuasive than a well-argued logical syllogism. Like Huxley and Burnham, he recognises that science has opened the door to previously unimaginable levels of totalitarian political control. He also foresaw how non-governmental organisations would have an increasing role in public life, and how an individual's importance would become directly tied to the organisation they represented. Another post-war development Russell predicted was how the rapidly changing scientific world would diminish the respect for the wisdom of elders, as the world moved so quickly that experiences were obsoleted as quickly as they were gained. In the United States, the immediate post-war era was considered a golden age, but was also a time of intense vigilance against the threat of communism at home and abroad. While Joe McCarthy stole the headlines, the Venona Project, unknown to the public at the time, was an intelligence operation initiated during World War II to decrypt Soviet messages. Some contained evidence of a considerable spy network at some of the highest levels of the American government, and helped secure convictions of the Rosenbergs. The project was highly classified, the only problem being that one of the few people who knew of its existence was British intelligence representative in America, Kim Philby, whose true loyalty was to his employers in Moscow, the KGB. Philby was one of the notorious Cambridge Five spy ring that included Don McLean, Guy Burgess, John Cairncross, and Anthony Blunt. Philby's access to the Venona Project allowed him to alert his colleague Don McLean that he was about to be exposed as a Soviet spy named Homer, mentioned in the intercepted cables. On the 28th of May, 1951, McLean and Guy Burgess boarded a ferry departing Southampton to France and escaped to the Soviet Union. This caused great suspicion to be cast upon Philby, who had expected only McLean to defect. Burgess, who once worked as a producer at the BBC and worked at MI6, had once broken one of the cardinal rules of espionage and stayed overnight at Philby's home. Philby was only able to survive as a premature accusation in the House of Commons led to him being exonerated by Foreign Secretary Harold Macmillan, despite Philby's denials being far from convincing.
The last time I spoke to a communist, knowing him to be a communist, was sometime in 1934.
Philby's treachery finally caught up with him while he was working as a journalist for The Observer and The Economist in Beirut, when he was exposed by an MI6 agent stationed there. Philby was able to escape by boarding the Soviet freighter Dolmatova, bound for Odessa. The two remaining members of the Cambridge Five, Anthony Blunt and John Cairncross, were never formally convicted of their crimes due to lack of evidence, although both were publicly exposed over the years. Cairncross moved to Rome, where he was still able to pick up work as a UN translator, while Anthony Blunt was removed from his position as surveyor of the Queen's pictures and stripped of his knighthood. He would later lament in his unfinished memoirs, "What I did not realise is that I was so naive politically that I was not justified in committing myself to any political action of this kind. The atmosphere of Cambridge was so intense, the enthusiasm for any anti-fascist activity was so great, that I made the biggest mistake of my life. The Suez Canal opened back in 1869 and immediately became of distinct strategic importance by shortening the route between the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean. In 1952, General Nasser had overthrown Egyptian King Farouk in a military coup, gaining control of the canal. Poor relations between Britain and Egypt were strained further when Prime Minister Eden suspected Nasser's influence in the sacking of Sir John Bagot Glubb as commander of the Arab Legion by putting pressure on King Hussein of Jordan. Nasser nationalised the canal in July 1956 and blockaded the Gulf of Aqaba, a contravention of the Constantinople Convention. Attempts to resolve this situation diplomatically faltered, and the Suez conflict began on the 29th of October 1956, when the Israeli Air Force attacked Egyptian positions in Sinai. The British and French, who had colluded with the Israelis, used this as an excuse to enter the war and seize the canal. The Anglo-French paratrooper assaults on Egyptian ports were a military success, but a political disaster. In response to Soviet nuclear threats and American financial pressure, Sir Anthony Eden declared a ceasefire, and the French and British were forced to accept Egyptian ownership of the canal. Eisenhower had hoped that his backing of Nasser would help improve American standing in the Middle East, but he was about to find out that there is no gratitude in international affairs. As historian John Lewis Gaddis wrote, "Even if it meant throwing the NATO alliance into its most decisive crisis yet, even if it meant alienating pro-Israeli constituencies on the eve of a presidential election in the United States, even if it meant risking what was left of the Anglo-American special relationship, even if it meant voting with the Soviet Union in the Security Council at a time when the Russians themselves were invading Hungary and crushing with far more brutality than anything that happened in Egypt a rebellion against their own authority there. The fact that the Eisenhower administration itself applied crushing economic pressure to the British and French to disengage from Suez, and that it subsequently forced an Israeli pushback from the Sinai as well. All this, one might have thought, would have won the United States the lasting gratitude of Nasser, the Egyptians, and the Arab world. Instead, the Americans lost influence in the Middle East as a result of Suez, while the Russians gained it. The Suez Crisis had emboldened Khrushchev, who now saw nuclear brinkmanship as an effective diplomatic tool, even though he was largely bluffing regarding the capability of Soviet ICBM forces, as later American U-2 flights would reveal. Soon the Cold War spotlight would move to Berlin, as the superpowers struggled to find a solution to the diplomatic status of the city. Berlin had been divided into US and Soviet-controlled areas, and West Berlin had become the primary route for anyone trying to flee the Soviet bloc for the West. Soviet attempts to prevent citizens migrating ultimately led to the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961. For Britain, the Suez Crisis had effectively ended its ambitions as a sovereign world power, just half a century after HMS Dreadnought had revolutionised naval warfare. In terms of foreign policy, it was now to all intents and purposes a vassal of the United States. Suez, along with the revelations of the Cambridge Five, had utterly destroyed the British establishment's reputation for competency, both at home and abroad. The Cold War would reach its most precarious moment in 1962, as the Cuban Missile Crisis threatened to escalate into World War III. As the superpowers confronted each other in Berlin, the disastrous CIA-backed Bay of Pigs invasion helped solidify the Cuban-Soviet alliance. The Soviets began to place tactical nuclear warheads in Cuba to both reduce the strategic missile disadvantage with the US and deter any further US military action in Cuba. On the 15th of October 1962, a U-2 spy plane photographed the missile silos. President Kennedy called the first ExComm meeting. This information was released to the public on the 22nd of October with the announcement of a naval blockade of Cuba.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
After a tense United Nations Security Council meeting on the 25th of October, Soviet ships headed for Cuba began to reverse course, and the following day, in a letter from Khrushchev to Kennedy, the Soviet leader suggested both men cease to pull on the rope in which the knot of war had been tied, opening the path for a diplomatic resolution. The 27th of October became known as Black Saturday, as a number of close calls underlined the precariousness of the situation. After a loss of communications, a Soviet submarine commander mistakenly believed a war had started. It was only thanks to the cool head of future Vice Admiral Vasily Arkhipov, who dissuaded his commanding officer from firing a nuclear torpedo at the US Navy, that prevented a nuclear exchange. The next day, an agreement was reached. The Soviets would discontinue building missiles in Cuba in return for the removal of American missiles in Turkey, plus assurances from the US not to invade Cuba, and the world could breathe a sigh of relief. The turbulent nature of 1960s geopolitics was reflected in the rapid social changes that were occurring in Western society during that period. Revelation of the crimes of Stalin's purges and the brutal suppression of the Hungarian uprising had eroded any remaining support the USSR had among the Western intelligentsia. It was around this time that the New Left began to form, inspired by the philosophy of Herbert Marcuse, who attempted to reconcile the writings of Marx with the intellectual developments of Freudian psychology. Marcuse concluded that the working classes were not in a revolutionary state, and argued Marxists should look to other groups like women, homosexuals, and ethnic minorities to be the vanguard of the revolution. In 1965, Marcuse published A Critique of Pure Tolerance, in which he attempts to justify the use of violence by oppressed groups. He also encourages Marxists to engage in a long march through the institutions to prepare society for revolutionary change, and had young protégés like Angela Davis prepared to carry out his mission. The invention of the contraceptive pill and the release of Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique had sparked the onset of the sexual revolution and second-wave feminism, one of the many profound changes taking place in American society in the 1960s. Not everyone was convinced that the sexual revolution was an entirely positive development. Published in 1966, Carroll Quigley's multidisciplinary work, Tragedy and Hope, had enormous scope, dealing mainly with international relations, but also contained an ominous prediction about psychosexual developments within the American middle-class family. As middle-class marriages were so often made for social reasons rather than personal attraction, they can often lead to unfulfilled middle-class mothers behaving in a fashion that accelerated the maturing of their daughters while infantilizing their sons. As far-fetched as the theory sounds, the earlier and earlier onset of menarche among girls throughout the Western world suggests the theory may not have been as outlandish as it first appears. The 1960s saw both the signing of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and, in Britain, Enoch Powell's infamous Rivers of Blood speech. Powell argued that he was merely expressing the concerns of his constituents, as any MP should. But the political fallout from the speech led to the Conservative leader, Ted Heath, sacking Powell from the shadow cabinet. Although it was a moment that would linger over the United Kingdom's politics for some time. Another event in international affairs that would have far-reaching domestic repercussions was the increasing US involvement in the Vietnam War. The US had been slowly dragged into the conflict in Indochina after the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu. An apparent attack on the US Navy by the North Vietnamese helped Lyndon Johnson, who had replaced the recently assassinated JFK, to persuade Congress to sign the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, authorizing the use of conventional US forces in Vietnam without an official declaration of war. At the outset, the Vietnam War had popular support among the American public, with only 24% of Americans thinking it was a mistake to send troops in 1965. There was a huge shift in public opinion due to the setback of the 1968 Tet Offensive, which made a mockery of LBJ's claim that victory was in sight. Along with the growing success of the anti-war movement, by late 1968, 54% of the American public were against the war, according to Gallup polls. Anti-war protests led to violent and chaotic scenes being broadcast on the nightly news, from the 1968 Democratic Convention to the Kent State University shootings. This double blow of the Tet Offensive and negative view of the war back home caused the morale of the US Army to deteriorate rapidly. The extent of draft dodging became so prevalent that Richard Nixon made it a central policy of his successful 1968 presidential campaign. The effect on the US military has been considerable, going from a total of 3.5 million personnel in 1969 to 2 million in 1985 to 1.3 million today, while the total US population has increased by around 130 million. Draft dodgers escaped abroad or into the hippie underground of cities like San Francisco.
The hippies present a strange problem. Our society has produced them. There they are in rapidly increasing numbers. And yet there seem to be very few definite ideas behind the superficial glitter of their dress and behavior. They're in favor of taking things easy. That much you can see at first glance. They like to seek out simple and inexpensive pleasures. Their main colony has grown up in a low-rent district of San Francisco, which is called Haight-Ashbury, from the intersection of two streets there. The place has become a mecca for young people from all over the nation who come in search of something new and significant for themselves. It is a mecca, too, for tourists who come to look at the hippies. So what was a quiet residential and shopping center has become a milling turmoil of seekers. Many of them are seeking a new sensation, and that is the drug lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD, or acid for short, possession of which has been declared illegal in California, but which is easily accessible here.
The influx of individuals with new left ideals slowly began to mould San Francisco into one of the most liberal cities in America. Vietnam was the end of the American post-war golden age. The optimism of those years began to evaporate. Although the Apollo moon landing provided a fitting send-off to a decade of free-spirited individualism, the coming decade of the 1970s would be remembered as a decade of economic stagnation and increasingly dystopian visions of the future. It was around this time that Dr. Henry Kissinger entered political office as Nixon's national security advisor. Foreign wars would continue to impact the domestic life of the USA. While the US was decreasing its direct involvement in Vietnam, huge amounts of supplies and material were still being shipped to the South Vietnamese army at the US taxpayers' expense. Printing money caused the dollar to become overvalued, and foreign countries began to exchange their dollar reserves for gold, causing further volatility. Addressing the nation on Sunday, August 15, 1971, Nixon announced the end of the convertibility of the dollar into gold. The end of the gold standard was the end of the Bretton Woods financial system and turned all major Western currencies into fiat currencies. While the US was focused on East Asia, the situation in the Middle East began to flare up again. The ceasefire negotiated between Israel and Egypt came to an abrupt end in May 1967. Nasser closed Egyptian waters to Israeli shipping, and the Israelis retaliated with a surprise air attack on the 5th of June, which devastated the Egyptian Air Force, giving the Israelis total control of the skies for the next 5 days of fighting. Egypt's Arab allies were slow to enter the conflict, and after 6 days, the Israelis had captured the entire Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip from Egypt, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. It was during this war that the attack by Israeli forces on the USS Liberty occurred. At the time it was covered up by LBJ and officially considered a friendly fire incident. However, evidence and testimony from the ship's sailors of that day's events suggest the Israelis knew they were attacking an American vessel. Israel attempted to exchange the conquered territories in return for recognition from the Arab states, but failed, and just 6 years later, the region erupted into violence once more. A joint surprise attack led by Egypt and Syria on the Jewish holy day of Yom Kippur in 1973 initially made gains as the Egyptians crossed the Suez Canal to retake some of the Sinai Peninsula, while the Syrians penetrated deep into the Golan Heights. The situation for the Israelis looked so bleak 2 days into the war that Golda Meir authorized the assembly of 13 20-kiloton nuclear warheads to be used in the case of impending total defeat. Kissinger used this threat of Armageddon to persuade the Defense and State Departments to airlift huge quantities of military aid to Israel. The Soviets quickly moved to resupply their Arab allies in response. After their initial setbacks, the Israelis launched successful counterattacks, encircling the Egyptian Third Army and coming within 20 miles of Damascus. The United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 340 on the 25th of October, to which both parties agreed, and the Fourth Arab-Israeli War was over. The war convinced Egyptian President Anwar Sadat that he would have to reach a diplomatic agreement with the Israelis. particularly after the Soviets had declined to enter the war on behalf of the Arabs. As Soviet leader, Brezhnev is reported to have remarked, "We have offered them a sensible way out for so many years, but no, they wanted to fight. Fine. We gave them the technology, the latest kind even Vietnam didn't have. They had double superiority in tanks and aircraft, triple in artillery, and in air defense and anti-tank weapons, they had absolute supremacy. And what? Once again they were beaten. Once again they scrammed. Once again they screamed for us to come and save them. Sadat woke me up in the middle of the night, twice over the phone. Save me! He demanded I send Soviet troops immediately. No, we are not going to fight for them." Angered by support for Israel during the war, the OPEC countries declared an oil embargo on all nations they saw as allies of Israel during the Yom Kippur War. The price of oil almost trebled overnight, having a widespread and devastating impact on the global economy. There were tailbacks at gas stations as drivers rushed to panic buy, causing some gas stations to ration fuel to 10 gallons per customer. The energy crisis had a psychological impact that caused some to reconsider the optimism of endless technological progress. In 1972, a team of computer scientists at MIT ran a computer simulation called World 3 that provided the basis for the Club of Rome's report, Limits to Growth. The report predicted that global industrial and food production would peak in the early 21st century, proceeding to rapid decline and then population collapse. The report was a watershed moment in the birth of the modern environmental movement. It was another sign of the trend of the increasing influence of private NGOs over national governments. Following the creation of the Council of Foreign Relations in the 1920s and the Bilderberg Group in the 1950s, the World Economic Forum was founded by Klaus Schwab in 1971. It was a new, more effective way of doing politics, to try and influence things from behind the scenes, rather than seek direct election into government.
We have business, of course, as a very important audience, and we have politics. We have continuous partnerships with many governments around the world. And of course, we have NGOs, we have trade unions, we have all those different parts. Media, of course. Media, of course, and very important experts and scientists and academia. Because if we are looking at the future, I think we should look at new solutions, and the new solutions will be very much driven by technological developments.
And we even have, you even have religious leaders, right?
We have religious leaders, we have social entrepreneurs, very important social entrepreneurs.
Renowned anti-communist President Nixon stunned the world when he made a diplomatic visit to China in 1972, prior to which the US had no formal diplomatic relations with the Chinese Communist Party. Kissinger was suspected of having orchestrated the move, which was widely regarded as a diplomatic coup. Unfortunately for Nixon, his presidency was about to be mired in one of the biggest political scandals of all time. On Saturday, June 17, 1972, after noticing suspicious activity, Watergate Hotel security guard Frank Willis called the police, who apprehended 5 burglars carrying equipment for both breaking and entering and spying. Nixon had been unaware of the attempted break-in, but money from the campaign to re-elect the president had been used to pay the burglars and purchase their equipment, leaving a money trail back to the president. Nixon's attempts to cover up the incident and hide his involvement were undermined by a mole, Deep Throat, leaking secrets to the press. Deep Throat was later revealed to be Deputy Director of the FBI, Mark Felt, who had coined the phrase follow the money. Pressure was increasing on Nixon, and on the 5th of August, the smoking gun tapes were released, removing any doubt of Nixon's involvement in the cover-up. With his political reputation completely unsalvageable, Nixon resigned the presidency on the 8th of August 1974, replaced by Vice President Gerald Ford. The suffix Gate has become synonymous with political scandal ever since. Watergate became a watershed moment in the beginning of the decline in trust that the general public feels about their elected officials. The end of an age of innocence when the vast majority of people had high levels of trust in the establishment. This mood was reflected in much of the dark and dystopian cinema produced during the 1970s. The film Network was released in 1976, documenting the attempts of news anchor Howard Beale to keep his job in an industry obsessed with ratings. It perfectly captured the dehumanizing direction in which Western society was headed.
The people spoke, the people won. It was a radiant eruption of democracy. But I think that was it, fellas. That sort of thing is not likely to happen again. Because at the bottom of all our terrified souls, we know that democracy is a dying giant, a sick, dying, decaying political concept writhing in its final pain. I don't mean that the United States is finished as a world power. The United States is the richest, the most powerful, the most advanced country in the world, light years ahead of any other country. And I don't mean the communists are going to take over the world, because the communists are deader than we are. What is finished is the idea that this great country is dedicated to the freedom and flourishing of every individual in it. It's the individual that's finished. It's the single, solitary human being that's finished. It's every single one of you out there that's finished. Because this is no longer a nation of independent individuals. It's a nation of some 200-odd million transistorized, deodorized, whiter than white, steel-belted bodies, totally unnecessary as human beings, and as replaceable as piston rods. Well, the time has come to say, is dehumanization such a bad word? Because good or bad, that's what is so. The whole world is becoming humanoid, creatures that look human but aren't. The whole world, not just us, we're just the most advanced country, so we're getting there first. The whole world's people are becoming mass-produced, programmed, numbered, insensate things.
It was a perfectly admissible argument that Howard Beale advanced in the days that followed. It was, however, also a very depressing one. Nobody particularly cared to hear his life was utterly valueless. By the end of the first week in June, the Howard Beale show had dropped 1 point in the ratings, and its trend of shares dipped under 48 for the first time since last November.
Second-wave feminism saw its peak in the 1970s. In Britain, the first domestic violence shelter was established by Erin Prizzy in Chiswick, in London, in 1971. Several additional shelters were later added, forming the nucleus of what was to become the charity Refuge. Prizzy wrote a book on her experiences called Prone to Violence, where she discussed the reciprocal nature of much domestic violence and how battered wives could be separated into two distinct categories: those who are innocent victims, who generally left after the first assault, and others who would consistently seek out violent men as partners. The book immediately made Prizzy persona non grata in the feminist community. Today, she is rarely, if ever, recognized for her pioneering work. The 1970s were a grim period in Britain. The post-war state-managed economy was struggling with stagflation, where high inflation, recession, and high unemployment converge at the same time, causing widespread economic misery. In 1976, the Callaghan government was forced to turn to the IMF for a bailout loan. This, along with the winter of discontent, cleared the way for Margaret Thatcher's 1979 general election victory. Two other trends that dominate the modern political landscape began to take hold of the public consciousness during the 70s: environmentalism and terrorism. In 1972, the opposition movement to a US nuclear test in Alaska that some people feared would cause an earthquake and tsunami eventually formed into Greenpeace. The test went ahead without geological disaster, but the activist networks formed in response would become a global NGO. Not a single year of the 1970s passed without at least an attempted airplane hijacking. They were carried out by various terrorist groups and also criminals seeking to exploit a financial ransom. From the late 1970s, the FBI were hunting this mysterious figure in a hooded sweatshirt and sunglasses after 2 bombs were sent to the Northwestern University. It would turn into the longest FBI manhunt of all time. In the United Kingdom, terrorism would become synonymous with the troubles in Northern Ireland. The violence that would engulf that region for 3 decades began on the 12th of August 1969, when the route of a loyalist march came within the vicinity of the Catholic stronghold of the Bogside. Hundreds of civilians and police were injured in a clash that saw RUC officers pelted with rocks and petrol bombs. The creation of a no-go area, declared to be under autonomous nationalist rule, was established, referred to as Free Derry. The Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association encouraged uprisings all over the country to relieve the pressure on the Bogside. There were nationalist uprisings in 8 different cities, with the bloodiest being the battles on the streets of Belfast, resulting in the deaths of 8 people. Both sides became increasingly paranoid about the other's intentions, and the Northern Ireland government requested the deployment of the British Army. Operation Banner had begun. During a weapons search in the nationalist area of Falls Road, rioters threw stones and Molotov cocktails, and 4 locals were killed when shooting erupted between the IRA and British soldiers. This incident was severely detrimental to the British Army's relationship with the Catholic working class, which would become irreparable after Bloody Sunday in 1972. Although the British Army had already lost 7 soldiers before that fateful day, including 3 who were lured to a remote area and then murdered in cold blood. As the 1970s ended, there was a dramatic shift in the political and social atmosphere in the US and Great Britain. The election of first Margaret Thatcher and then Ronald Reagan suggested a reaction against the mindset of managed decline, pessimism, and hopelessness that had hung over the West during the 1970s. Both shared the desire and will to confront the Soviet Union rather than accept communist domination of the East as a fait accompli. Both were firm believers in low taxes and the free market, and felt the West was beginning to lag behind other rising industrial powers, especially Japan. Cheap and efficient Japanese vehicles were beginning to flood into the American and European markets, and the Nikkei was a bull market for most of the 1980s. London's stock market deregulation in 1986 meant the brokers and jobbers who made the market by holding stocks and shares no longer needed to be independent of each other. The massive increase in financial activity on the FTSE as a result of these changes is referred to as the Big Bang. That same year produced one of the most dramatic live television moments ever, the Challenger Space Shuttle launch. The Space Shuttle program had been coming under criticism due to what many considered to be an extravagant budget, running into billions of dollars. To increase public enthusiasm for the program, it was decided to send a schoolteacher into space. The launch was scheduled to be broadcast on live television in front of school children throughout the country. Increased media interest in the launch and the likely negative press fallout from repeated launch cancellations pressured NASA into a decision to launch on January the 28th, despite warnings that it was too cold. But it was too cold. The rubber seals on the solid rocket boosters, having contracted in cold temperatures, failed, causing a catastrophic explosion and the loss of the Challenger and its crew. Exploration had been a dominant theme of Western civilization since the days of Marco Polo and Ferdinand Magellan, driven by the Faustian urge towards the infinite. Whether it was the fallout from the tragedy of Challenger or something more intangible, the wonder of space exploration no longer seemed to capture the public imagination in the ways the Apollo missions did. While the facade of the 80s suggested a resurgent Western civilization, certain subversive undercurrents were continuing to brew beneath the surface. When Roger Scruton published The New Thinkers of the Left in 1985, it effectively ended his teaching career and led to calls to boycott the publisher, Longman Books, for having the audacity to print such a work. It was some of the first evidence that the long march through the institutions that Marcuse had prescribed in the 60s was starting to make its presence felt in the academic world, and is reminiscent of what we now refer to as council culture. Another example of the rising tide of a desire for censorship was the publication of the Satanic Verses by Salman Rushdie. Ayatollah Khomeini, who came to power in the Iranian Revolution of the late 70s, issued a fatwa on Rushdie's head. Protests spread to the Islamic community in Britain, an early warning that integration of some immigrant communities might be slightly lacking. The Thatcher government stood firm with the principle of freedom of speech and gave Rushdie 24-hour police protection.
We're really rather afraid that this country might be rather swamped by people with a different culture. And you know, the British character has done so much for democracy, for law, and done so much throughout the world, that if there's any fear that it might be swamped, people are going to react and be rather hostile to those coming in. So if you want good race relations, you've got to allay people's fears on numbers. That's one thing that's driving some people to the National Front. They don't agree with the objectives of the National Front, but they say that at least they're talking about some of the problems. Now, we, the big political parties, if we don't want people to go to extremes, and I don't, we ourselves must talk about this problem, and we must show that we're prepared to deal with it.
Another well-recognised current trend that was growing during the 80s was environmental extremism. In 1986, Greenpeace co-founder Patrick Moore left the organisation in response to what he felt was the increasing dogmatism of the environmental movement, which began to abandon science and logic for scare tactics and sensationalism.
And finally, a federal report today predicted possible catastrophic warming of the Earth by the 1990s with the strong climate change. I'm Jessica Savage in New York.
In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became leader of the Soviet Union. His priorities were to end the war in Afghanistan and reform the Soviet economy that had begun to stagnate and lag behind the West. In 1987, the policies of glasnost, or openness, reduced media censorship, while the policy of perestroika, or restructuring, allowed for some market reforms within the command economy. The new press freedoms led to calls for multi-party elections in many Eastern Bloc states. Gorbachev had rejected the Brezhnev doctrine of military intervention in Warsaw Pact states and withdrawn 500,000 Soviet troops from the Eastern Bloc. In 1989, a wave of revolution spread across Eastern Europe as country after country rejected communist rule. First Poland and then Hungary left the Eastern Bloc. Protests in Germany turned into widespread demonstrations and the opening of the east-west border in Berlin for the first time since 1961. On the night of the 9th of November 1989, the Berlin Wall was torn down, and once again the Soviets did not intervene. These events did not strengthen Gorbachev's position back in Moscow, as he came under attack from both communist hardliners and liberal reformers. In 1991, hardliners attempted a coup against Gorbachev, using KGB agents to detain him in his holiday Dachau. But resistance from recently elected Russian President Boris Yeltsin, who rallied public support against the coup, meant Gorbachev clung to power. In response, the Supreme Soviet suspended all Communist Party activity, effectively ending communist rule in the USSR, which would collapse within 4 months. Ukraine voted for independence on the 1st of December, and a week later, Yeltsin would sign the Leviathan Accords without Gorbachev's knowledge, and Lenin's utopian dream was over. Though many had peered across the Iron Curtain with envy at the perceived opulence of the West, the Russian experience of free market economics would not be a happy one. The global financial institutions advised the new Yeltsin government on the transition from a command to free market economy. But for the average Russian, their policies were a disaster. The IMF's attempt to introduce a rapid transition failed because it attempted to pursue policies designed for countries where institutions of the free market had been built up over more than a century. No such institutions existed in Russia. Rapid privatization led to state industries being sold off for a fraction of their actual value. This is the era when oligarchs like Roman Abramovich made their billions. The liberalization of Russian capital markets meant many of these oligarchs started to move their fortunes overseas, resulting in huge capital outflows and putting pressure on the ruble. The IMF and World Bank loaned increasing amounts to the Russian government to shore up the ruble, as they felt devaluation would lead to hyperinflation. Part of the motivation for the continuous loans was the Western desire to maintain Yeltsin in power. But as the country's GDP plummeted and Yeltsin's behaviour became more and more erratic, nothing could be done to save him. Russia's economy had been reduced to a natural resource exporter, and the collapse of the oil price in 1998 made a devaluation inevitable. Yeltsin resigned on the 31st of December 1999, and former KGB agent Vladimir Putin became acting president. In Britain, the invisible hand of the global currency markets was also giving us the finger in the form of Black Wednesday. Back in 1990, the UK had entered pound sterling into the European Exchange Rate Mechanism, or ERM, which fixed the value of European countries' currencies to within certain limits in order to stabilise them ahead of the transition to the European single currency. It was widely believed that the UK had entered the ERM at too high a value of £1 to 2.95 Deutschmarks, and currency speculators started selling pounds in anticipation of a devaluation. The Bank of England was spending billions on supporting the pound in the currency markets. Prime Minister John Major and Chancellor Norman Lamont were publicly committed to defending the pound and raised interest rates to 12%. This move only encouraged the view that the government was getting desperate, and the attacks on the pound increased. After raising rates again to 15%, and the Bank of England threw £15 billion at the currency markets, in one day the pound crashed out of the ERM on the 16th of September 1992.
Today has been an extremely difficult and turbulent day. Massive speculative flows have continued to disrupt the functioning of the exchange rate mechanism. As chairman of the Council of European Finance Ministers, I have called a meeting of the Monetary Committee in Brussels urgently tonight to consider how stability can be restored to the foreign exchange markets. In the meantime, the government has concluded that Britain's best interests are served by suspending our membership of the exchange rate mechanism. As a result, the second of the two interest rate increases that I sanctioned today will not take place tomorrow, and minimum lending rate will be at 12% until conditions become calmer. I will be reporting to Cabinet, discussing the situation with colleagues tomorrow, and may make further statements then. But until then, I have nothing further to say. Thank you very much.
Mr. Lamont, what about those in your party that are calling for your resignation?
Black Wednesday completely destroyed the Conservative government's reputation for economic competence, paving the way for the New Labour landslide in 1997. For some currency speculators, most notably Soros Fund Management, it had been very lucrative indeed.
It was in excess of $1 billion of profits.
Japan had been the economic success story of the 80s, but the Nikkei 225 shares index suffered a major crash and has still not risen above the 40,000 points record high set back in 1990. In the communist state of Yugoslavia, which had been outside the Soviet sphere of influence, they had been lurching from one constitutional crisis to the next since the death of their former leader Tito in 1980. Rising tensions between the Serbian population and locals in the provinces led to a clash between police and Serbian militias at Plitvice Lakes National Park, causing the Yugoslav army to be called in. A few months later, Slovenia and Croatia declared independence, and civil war broke out. The siege of Sarajevo in the Bosnian War lasted from April 5, 1992 until the 29th of April 1996, 3 times longer than the battle for Stalingrad. Yugoslavia had been a meeting point for 3 historic civilizations: Western, Orthodox and Islamic. Its violent dissolution cast a foreboding shadow over the future. In 1995, the longest manhunt in US history began its closing stages when on September the 19th, the Washington Post published the Unabomber Manifesto in return for an end to a terrorist campaign that had stretched over 17 years. The manifesto was a 35,000-word polemic against industrial society that was extremely radical in its conclusions. But some elements, notably Kaczynski's psychological analysis of the modern political left, have become difficult to ignore. Kaczynski tears into the leftist intelligentsia he had encountered during his time at Harvard, detailing how their activism is in fact driven by feelings of inferiority combined with over-socialization. This leads leftists, who desire to be rebels but lack the strength of character to actually break societal norms, to take an accepted moral principle, adopt it as their own, then accuse society of violating that principle. It seems that since Kaczynski wrote the manifesto, the modern left has done everything in their power to prove him right. The publication of the manifesto may have been a triumph for Kaczynski, but ultimately led to his downfall. His brother recognized the ideas and writing style and tipped off the FBI. Kaczynski was not the only person raising concerns about the direction Western academia was heading. In her 1999 book, Who Stole Feminism?, Christina Hoff Sommers highlighted both the growing trend of the fabrication of statistics and the hijacking of campus administrations by radical feminists. According to Sommers, it had become impossible to be appointed to high office in the American university system without the approval of the gender feminists.
Small liberal arts colleges, the more elite the university, the more likely this is happening. I think it's a contagion of hysteria. And I don't use those words lightly, because in the past I always thought it was eccentric, it was strange, these young women were a little, carried away. This is more than carried away. And it's not all the students, of course, but a sort of critical mass of young women and some young men believe that students at a place like Swarthmore or Wesleyan, Bard College, Columbia University, that they are, the women are captive to this tyrannical, patriarchal, oppressive, violent culture.
Camille Peligula was also vocal in her concerns about Western academia.
I'm totally opposed to any politicized agenda in the classroom, okay? I do not want this crappy melodrama being taught to our students that Western civilization is filled with evil patriarchs and out there are the wonderful people of color, okay?
Well, but I don't think anyone that I know of that believes that just think of what you just said.
The new historicists, listen, you don't know, Stephen Greenblatt, the new historicists, okay, I mean, my God, every word out of their mouth is about the evil of Western culture. You don't know how bad it is.
All Western culture is evil,
yeah,
and all
you don't know how bad it is.
Asian or African culture is unflawed.
These people in the who have control of the university's humanities departments now do not believe in great art. Okay, they do not. They believe the dead white European males are just.
At the time, it was easy to dismiss as the office politics of obscure university departments. But in time, the negative consequences for Western academia have become clear for all to see. With the Cold War over, the West had become filled with optimism for the future. Britain had recovered from Black Wednesday to enter what would be a decade of uninterrupted growth. German reunification boosted growth on the continent, and the US economy was buoyant under Bill Clinton. The outlook for future global peace seemed to be becoming rosier with the signing of the Oslo Accords in 93 and 95. At the time, the recognition of Israel by the PLO and vice versa meant many thought a lasting peace in the Middle East was just around the corner. And Clinton basked in the positive press coverage. In 1997, Great Britain said goodbye to Hong Kong, the last economically significant colony in the empire, on the understanding that the colonial legal system would remain under the one country, two systems policy. The British Empire, which had been the largest empire the world had ever known at its point of furthest geographical reach in 1922, had disappeared in 75 years. It was perhaps fitting that that same year, Britain elected as Prime Minister the archetype of the modern professional managerial class that was forming the new establishment, Tony Blair. The signing of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998 brought an end to 3 decades of violence in Northern Ireland and was another sign that many of the world's troubles would be solved in this bright post-Cold War world. The global economy was growing off the back of the dot-com boom, which saw the Nasdaq rise 800% between 1995 and 2000. It was widely believed that we had entered a post-historical era of endless economic growth liberalism, and democracy. Francis Fukuyama became the vogue intellectual of the day. His book, The End of History, detailed the triumph of free markets and parliamentary democracy and was critically acclaimed by the globalist elites. There was one person who had an alternative assessment of the grand chessboard: Fukuyama's former teacher at Harvard, Samuel Huntington. Huntington saw the post-Cold War world as consisting of 7 to 8 civilizations, with the most important countries in the world located in different civilizations. This increased the potential for conflict in the future as the dichotomy of the superpower standoff gave way to a multipolar world. Huntington also warned of the nefarious influence of Davos Man and the increasingly anti-Western rhetoric emanating from elite colleges like Harvard. He will likely go on to be considered one of the late 20th century's great political visionaries. But like most visionaries, nobody listened to him at the time. As the end of the millennium approached, the promised land seemed within reach, and the West was preparing to party like it was 1999. When in a small town in Colorado, a tragedy struck that evoked the ominous sense that something was deeply wrong in the fabric of Western society. On the 20th of April 1999, Columbine High School students Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold arrived at school armed with semi-automatic weapons and embarked on a shooting spree that killed 13 of their classmates and injured a further 24. In the 90s, these incidents were rare enough to be considered an anomaly, and as the clock struck 12 on New Year's Eve 1999, the West could be confident that as it entered the 21st century, the violence, ethnic conflict, and global battles over political ideology that had characterized the 20th century would become a relic of the past. But as you know all too well, dear viewer, the beginning of the 21st century has been the exact opposite of this utopian vision. The dot-com boom turned to bust in 2000, followed by the first vindication of Huntington's thesis in the form of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. The wars launched in response to 9/11 have all resulted in failure, while the Federal Reserve's decision to lower interest rates to prevent a recession in the wake of these events opened the way for the reckless lending that culminated in the 2008 financial crisis and the Occupy movement. In the second decade of the 21st century, political discourse has been dominated by the culture wars. The rise of the internet has played a key role in the new media landscape, as the control over information that reaches the public and the gatekeepers of political discourse have effectively been removed. The past decade has produced countless examples of events that have eroded public trust in the vital institutions of Western society. Academia, the media, and the established political parties have all seen a free fall in their public support. Even the most casual political observer can feel the dissolution of any consensus on an increasing number of issues. The black market of ideas that has spread across the internet has led to the resurrection of many intellectual currents and thinkers who have been unfashionable for a long time. The dark enlightenment of Nick Land, Curtis Yarvin's unqualified reservations, and Bap's Bronze Age mindset gaining large cult followings online, despite the obvious disdain from the mainstream. The Populist Delusion, written by Nima Parvini in 2020, is perhaps the most concise analysis of what is known as the Italian elite school of thinkers that are so influential over the revolution in understanding of how power actually functions in modern 21st century Western societies. Parvini interprets the ideas of 10 different elite school theorists to demonstrate how change is always top-down and never bottom-up, and explains what he describes as the 4 myths of liberalism. In an analogy of our current situation, Parvini likens it to the relationship between the students' union and the general mass of students at a university. Incidentally, the iron law of oligarchy explains at a stroke why the long march of the left through the institutions since 1945 in both America and across Europe has been so effective. They never needed to persuade most people in the populace, or even at an organisational level, of their view. They simply needed to capture the leadership to impose their will. The typical student at a university is not an activist. They are mostly disinterested. As Michel says of young trade union members, they are heedless. Their thoughts run in erotic channels. They are always hoping some miracle will deliver them from the need of passing their lives as simple wage earners. But the leadership of the student union is not. In every university, therefore, the will of the student union leadership will prevail on campus. If that will is to enforce a quasi-Marxist hegemony, then that will be the case too, on every campus. And so we might see how society might wake up one day to find that it had sleepwalked into a quasi-Marxist progressive hegemony. The hard check on this is the mass will not tolerate intrusive interventions into their everyday lives. Let us imagine the leadership of a student union sought to ban meat on campus in the name of their political agenda. In such circumstances, one might imagine a rapid and organised response from outraged students who do not want to have vegetarianism imposed on them, and the student union would likely experience its own circulation of elites. However, the leadership would know this limitation and not push so far as to deprive themselves of power. In other words, if they are canny, the leaders will take what they can get away with and no more. This is the reality of 21st century Western politics. It is not the power of the people that decide political outcomes, but the power of the politically inclined, organised minority.
And I'm concerned about the attitude of the elite, who are too much taken up by this laissez-faire ideology that you leave it to the markets and everything will take care of itself. So I think there has to be a change of heart among the leadership. And so there is, I think, among the professionals, an increasing resistance to it.
So a non-revolutionary revolution of a sort.
Right. You see, while I am sort of almost a specialist in revolutions, in actual fact, I prefer non-revolutionary change. I like the political process to work.
Although more and more of our elites are of questionable caliber.
Inflation has just pretty much come about from nowhere.
If we are ruled by organised minorities, then what plans do they have for the future? It is likely to be the tech-talitarian vision of the likes of Dr. Harari, where everyone and everything has been reduced to a manageable data stream. Unfortunately for the masses, this way of thinking leads to extreme misanthropy.
Again, I think that the biggest question maybe in economics and politics of the coming decades will be what to do with all these useless people. I don't think we have an economic model for that. My best guess, which is just a guess, is that food will not be a problem. with that kind of technology, you will be able to produce food to feed everybody. The problem is more boredom and what to do with them, and how will they find some sense of meaning in life when they are basically meaningless, worthless. My best guess at present is a combination of drugs and computer games.
You might wonder how an obscure academic from Tel Aviv University, who is a distinctly mediocre writer, became so influential and sold so many books.
A book by an Israeli author, Yuval Harari, called Sapiens. And it's a sweeping history of the human race from 40,000 feet.
It pays to have a good agent. The declassification of the recently deceased Dr. Kissinger's National Security Study Memorandum 200 in the 90s was a smoking gun that population control has been on the elite agenda since the 1970s and is likely the driving force behind much of today's environmental alarmism. The sexual revolution has led to a fertility crisis where most Western nations are now below the 2+ average children that is required to maintain population. As a result, the West is now facing a demographic crisis where the economy is weighed down by too many retirees and not enough economically active workers. Many millennials and Zoomers who grew up in middle-class affluence will be denied that vital marker of the bourgeois, home ownership. In the 1990s, a low to middle-class income, saving 5% of their wages, would have enough deposit for an average house in the UK after 3 years. Today it would take 24. Western governments have attempted to counteract this through mass migration, but this solution is starting to become politically untenable. People are starting to discover the difference between a high and low trust society. The presence of the world's communities within the West mean that foreign affairs become part of domestic politics, and the threat of balkanization intensifies, as even some of our elites are starting to realize.
Was a grave mistake to let in so many people of totally different cultural and religious and concepts, because it creates a pressure group inside each country that does that.
The Ukraine war marks the end of globalization as we know it, and the failure of Western attempts to isolate Russia economically further vindicate Huntington's Clash of Civilizations thesis. By backing the Ukrainians, who have fought the war under a draconian conscription regime, with no males over the age of 18 being allowed to leave the country, while the West accepts hordes of fighting-age males from unspecified wars around the globe, Western leaders have made a mockery of their own asylum systems. The large number of casualties on both sides in the Russia-Ukraine war shows even modern 21st century warfare requires and costs boots on the ground. The current recruitment crisis in the US military and the lack of public support for foreign interventions weakens NATO's ability to project its military might, a trend that shows no sign of reversing. The story of the 20th century is the chimera of progress, from which the people of the West are slowly waking up, but are unable to effect change as they misunderstand the realities of political power. We may hope that a competent counter-elite might form together and somehow overthrow our current overlords.
I mean, Soros actually, you know, he is, I believe, the top contributor to the Democratic Party. The second one was Sam Bankman-Fried. Yeah. So, and Soros, I don't know. I mean, he had a very difficult upbringing, and in my opinion, he fundamentally hates humanity. That's my opinion.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, well, he's doing things that erode the fabric of civilization. You know, getting DAs elected who refuse to prosecute crime. That's part of the problem in San Francisco and LA and a bunch of other cities. So why would you do that?
Was it humanity, or is it just the United States as a whole? I mean,
he's pushing things in other countries too, not
doing
just
the
here.
same thing?
Yeah. Now, George at this point is pretty old. I mean, he's not, you know, he's basically a bit senile at this point. But I mean, he's very smart, and he's very good at arbitrage. You know, famously he shorted the British pound. That's sort of how I think he made his first money, was shorting the pound. So he's good at spotting, basically arbitrage, like spotting value for money that other people don't see. So one of the things he noticed was that that the value for money in local races is much higher than it is in national races. So the lowest value for money is a presidential race. Then next lowest value for money is a Senate race, then a Congress, and but once you get to sort of city and state district attorneys, the value for money is extremely good. And Soros realized that you don't actually need to change the laws, you just need to change how they're enforced. If nobody chooses to enforce the law, or the laws are differentially enforced, it's like changing the laws.
But it may already be too late.
There may be trouble ahead, but while there's moonlight and music and love and romance, let's face the music and dance. Before the fiddlers have fled, before they ask us to pay the bill, and while we still have the chance, let's face the music and dance. Soon we'll be without the moon, humming a different tune, and then there may be teardrops to shed. So while there's moonlight and music and love and romance, let's face the music and dance. Let's face the music and dance. Soon we'll be without the moon, humming a different tune, and then there may be teardrops to shed. So while there's moonlight and music and love and romance, let's face the music and dance. Let's face the music and dance.